Hi YouTube, today I'm going to be doing a video tutorial on how to replace the timing belt on your 7th generation Honda Civic or 2nd generation Acura 1.7 EL. The model years that are in those generations is 2001 through 2005, single overhead cam, 1.7 liter VTEC and non-VTEC engines. This replacement procedure does not apply to the SI or the SIR version that uses the 2-liter VTEC twin cam engine. Before we do any type of engine work in the engine bay, we want to make sure that we disconnect the negative battery terminal so that the vehicle is completely de-energized. And this is really important to ensure that accessories such as remote car starters don't accidentally engage while you're working on the car, as well as to protect yourself from shorting out things when you're removing the alternator. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove all the accessory items such as cosmetic covers by using our flat-bladed screwdriver to give the two slotted screws here a quarter turn counterclockwise and lift up. Using a 10mm wrench, we're going to undo the spark plug coils 1, 2, 3, 4, as well as the retaining bolt on the right and on the left that holds the wiring harness to the top of the valve cover, as well as the cable assembly retainers, which is also these 10mm cap nuts located here and here. Go ahead and remove the spark plug ignition coils by lifting up and then squeezing the tab on the connector and disconnecting the wiring harness from the coil. Lift the throttle and cruise control cable assembly off of the valve cover and tuck it in behind the air cleaner assembly so it's out of the way. The next step here is to undo all the nuts and bolts in the power steering pump region, and we can do this by undoing the 12mm bolt that's retaining the power steering pump on the upper bracket and then one directly behind this front pulley. You can gain access to the lower power steering pump bolt by lifting up on the fluid reservoir like this and just sliding it off its bracket. Using a 12mm socket on a quarter drive ratchet, you're going to have to tuck your ratchet in underneath the belt and undo the power steering nut on the lower bracket assembly. Now, if your timing belt's never been replaced like it is on this vehicle, all the nuts and bolts can be quite tight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an extension pipe just to help me break some of these bolts loose. Carefully reach down and then remove the nut by hand. Now we're going to loosen the tension on the power steering belt by using a pair of pliers and then turning this little wing nut counterclockwise. And as you continue to unscrew it, the power steering pump will begin to lower and slide down on the bracket. And what you want to do is actually completely remove this wing nut tensioner tightening bolt. Like this. And then, to make access a little bit easier, we're also going to go ahead and remove this upper bracket assembly with our 10mm ratchet. And take this bracket out of the way. Now, a quick service tip here, if you don't want to lose the screws, just loosely reinstall them back into where you took them out from. Then remove the upper power steering sliding stud. And now the power steering pedal should move freely. And you should now also be able to pull it away, exposing the lower power steering bolt, which will just kind of fall out of the bottom there. And this is what it looks like. We can now unhook the belt off the pulley, undo the power steering hoses from the clips in the upper brackets by pulling them out, taking careful not to kink or damage any of the hose crimps. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this entire assembly and place it on top of the engine so it's completely out of the way. And that's where I've actually tucked it away from. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to go ahead and undo the air conditioning upper suction line hose and undo it from the bracing bracket. Now undo this bracing bracket from the power steering bracket, again with your 10mm wrench or ratchet. And this is what that assembly looks like. Again, to ensure I don't lose my screws, I'm going to screw them back into the spots that I removed them from. We're now going to take off the upper alternating retaining bracket, or the alternator wiring harness retaining bracket that's directly underneath this air conditioning suction hose. Again, just taking off these little extra pieces here makes our disassembly process so much easier by giving us that little bit of room. Let's disconnect that. That's what that bracket looks like. We can now go ahead and disconnect the alternator signaling cables and power feed cables. And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to unhook this sort of L bracket assembly by pressing on the tab located on the back of this connector down towards the alternator and sliding it off the bracket. We're then going to expose, if you can see this, the alternator sort of sensing connector. And it's a little bit tight in here, so you're just going to have to work it out like this. And this is that retaining tab I was talking about right here. And then we're going to peel back the positive output connector on the back of the alternator to expose the 10mm nut that's is used to feed the car with 12-volt power. Now I just changed the view to the back of the alternator to give you an idea of what this back power connector looks like. And so one of the things that I commonly see is that when people actually undo this 10mm nut here on the back of the alternator, they actually damage the voltage regulator isolation post, which is the plastic that surrounds this nut here to protect it from shorting out to the body of the alternator, which is ground. So what we actually need to do is that we need to use a pair of pliers to prevent this wire from wiggling back and forth, which will then enable us to properly undo the alternator power feed cable. And so I'm hoping you guys can see this, but I'm going to take a pair of needle nose pliers in from the front of the alternator to carefully hold the power cable from wiggling. You can see that like this. And then very carefully I'm going to use my 10mm ratchet to undo that nut. And by preventing the cable from shifting around, you're basically preventing it from twisting and then snapping the regulator's isolation bushing. And just as a note, when you're reinstalling this cable, it doesn't need to be torqued down very tight. Just probably 7 foot-pounds or finger tight, as long as the connection is clean. And once I've disconnected that, that's what that little 10mm nut looks like. We can pull the cables away. You can now undo the alternator by using a 14mm ratchet and undoing the upper alternator mounting bolt located right here, and then the lower mounting bolt that's located by the belt area down in the engine bay that you can't see in the video. But if you use a bright light and look, you will see it. So I'm just going to loosen the upper alternator bolt, and then I'm going to switch my sockets to a 12mm to undo the lower bolt. So I can't really have a tripod mounted to show you where the lower alternator retaining bolt is, but basically I just reach down in the engine bay directly below the pulley with a 12mm socket on the end of my 3/8 drive ratchet, and we're going to unloosen that and completely remove that lower bolt. And this is what that lower alternator mounting bolt looks like. And you can see here that this is the style of the head, so you can't make a mistake of which one you're going to be removing. We can now go ahead and completely undo the upper alternator mounting bolt. Now the reason why we had to remove that power steering bracket earlier from the side of the engine bay rail there is because as you remove the alternator upper bolt, it actually doesn't completely come out. It actually just slides out of the way. And so that extra few millimeters of clearance is what you need to be able to undo the alternator from the alternator bracket. And then once we've slid the alternator bracket or bolt out, we'll go ahead and press down on our alternator to take the tension off the belt. Unloop the belt, if you guys can see what I'm doing here, which I don't think you can. And then using a screwdriver, pry at the bracket mounting point to undo the alternator assembly. So this is what that lower mount point looks like on the alternator, and this is the upper portion right here. Now, when I was removing the wiring harness earlier, this is that isolator bushing I was telling you about. Normally what happens is that the wiring harness, it has a ring connector and it comes out this way. If this was all corroded and really tight and you're undoing that nut, it's going to cause a rotational force on that cable assembly to move together with the nut, which then jams up against the end of this regulator isolator and then basically will cause this to all fall apart and break. And so by using a pair of pliers from the backside and we're holding that cable from shifting back and forth, then it gives us the ability to remove the back nut without damaging the isolation part of the regulator. So earlier the power steering reservoir bracket was here and we removed it. As you can see here that this bolt goes right to the end of the sidewall here, and as you can tell, if I didn't move that I wouldn't have enough clearance to actually pull this alternator away. This is why we needed it to be removed. We now go ahead and take the belt off from the crankshaft and the air conditioning compressor below, the power steering hose that we removed earlier, and then we also can now go ahead and unscrew this piece right here, which is actually the alternator belt tensioner. So normally some people would just go ahead and unscrew this by hand, but because of all the dirt and corrosion that could take forever or be very difficult. So it's just easier to remove that lower mounting stud for the alternator completely and then just let this dangle out and then just pull the alternator and remove it after the fact when you have lots of room like we do here now. Now that we've removed the power steering, the alternator, and have freed up the wiring harness that connects to the alternator, we can now go ahead and carefully undo the little clips that retain the wiring harnesses to the top of the valve cover and then flip this out of the way. Now, one of the things that make things easier without damaging it is to also disconnect the coolant temperature sensor located here, as well as our EGR valve connector, just so that it gives us a little more slack so that we can flip this harness out. We can now go ahead and undo the 5 valve cover bolts located here, 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 and here. You'll take notice that I did not remove the spark plugs yet, and the reason why I haven't done so is that I want to make sure I protect the internals of the engine from any inadvertent debris that might fall down, such as nuts and bolts, during the disassembly process. In fact, the spark plugs will be likely one of the last steps that we're going to be taking apart. Remove the engine oil dipstick. Now, the other thing we need to do is disconnect this air cleaner breather hose here. And we're just going to do so by using our fingers to remove this little clip. And then using a pair of pliers to break the seal on the valve cover, and then we're going to have to use a little bit of force here to press it off. Now, how you break the seal is you want to get a pair of pliers like this and just gently pinch the hose and then move it back and forth so that we break that seal. Like that. Now, there's actually one final screw that needs to be removed from the valve cover before the valve cover can actually be removed from the engine, and that's this air conditioning suction hose that's held in with this really long 10mm bolt located right here, which frees up this bracket assembly. And what I found that works is I just use a pair of pliers like this and then place it on the end of the hose and then just wiggle back and forth to press the hose off of the cover nipple. Now, FYI guys, this hose can be quite a pain in the you-know-what, because I don't really know why Honda designed it the way they did, such that it wasn't very easy to remove. That hose looks like once it's been removed. Now the next step, once this hose has been lifted up, is that we want to remove this upper sort of wiring harness that's attached to the valve cover. And you want to be really careful here that this hose is out of the way and that you flex the rail of this wiring harness cover over this nipple so that you just get that little bit of extra clearance needed to unhook this wiring harness off of the valve cover studs. Again, you don't want to break anything here. And I always undo the left side and then press up where the nipple is to undo the right. Like that. And then if everything has been removed and unbolted properly, you just got to grab the valve cover on the left and the right and just give it a wiggle to break the seal. And so you can even bend the air conditioning line out just a few millimeters to give you that clearance that you need to undo your valve cover. Now, I strongly advise against using any screwdrivers or any objects to pry the valve cover off. The reason why is that if you mar the mating surfaces of where the valve cover sits on the head, you're going to end up getting an oil leak. And sometimes using liquid sealant like Ultra, Permatex Gray, or Honda Bond is not going to solve your problem. So just be aware of that. I also forgot to mention that you want to remove this little bracket here on the back of our valve cover that retains the air conditioning hose position. Like that. And then just slide this bracket out of the way. And your valve cover should just come off like this. Using our ratchet, 10mm socket, and a series of small extensions, we can now go ahead and remove the timing belt, the upper timing belt cover, which is held in with three screws held in here and here. With the vehicle raised and placed on a set of strong jack stands on both the driver and passenger front side, parking brake applied, and the rear wheels chocked, we can now go ahead and remove the driver's side wheel and then remove the lower timing belt cover assembly. Okay. So what I've done here is that I've actually jacked up the vehicle and placed it on a set of sturdy jack stands, making sure that my parking brake is fully applied and my rear wheels chocked. So with the driver's side wheel removed, we need to now expose the crankshaft pulley, which is located behind this lower wheel well cover. And we can gain access to this by using two flat-bladed screwdrivers to remove the little pop rivet located here and right inside there. So what we're going to do is just place our screwdriver into the slotted ends of this pop rivet. Now, depending on how old your car is or how much corrosion there might be and how seized up the clips are, that centerpiece may not pop out. But on this relatively low mileage vehicle, they just came out like this. And then once they've loosened up, you can just use your fingers to pull them out. As so. And repeat the same for this side. And then you can just pull down and fold this cover all the way. You can see that there's the crankshaft. So now that we're pretty much at the stage of getting the engine set up to top dead center positioning to remove our timing belt, now is actually the right time to go ahead and now remove the spark plugs from the cylinder head. And so the reason why we want to do this now is because we want to eliminate as much engine compression as we can to make rotating the engine more effortless. So now that the spark plugs have been removed from the engine, we're now ready to preset the engine at top dead center in preparation for us to undo the crankshaft bolt and begin the timing belt removal process. But in doing so, we need to make sure that we have our relative cam and camshaft positioning set accurately so that we don't make the fateful mistake of mistiming the motor and then damaging all the valves upon engine startup or rotation. And so basically what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to get a 19mm socket and attach it to the end of a long 1/2" drive ratchet, and I'm going to just rotate the engine's crankshaft from below the car, from the crankshaft pulley that I had showed you earlier that I exposed, so that we can sort of get a sense of how the motor works on the Civic. So as you can see here on the pulley, never ever turn it clockwise, guys, by the way, for the Civic. It's always a counterclockwise rotation on the D series motor. But basically what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to look at these different segments on the camshaft sprocket, and I'm going to look for one that says up on it. Now I know you guys will not be able to see this in my video just because there's no one holding the camera for me. And I'll go ahead and just keep rotating until I begin to see up point towards the top of the engine. So I see up located here, which means that 90 degrees to the left and to the right of this, I'm going to see a little notch actually cut into the cam sprocket located at the front, and then another one, if you can see it, located at the back. And so how we know this engine is top dead center is that this little notch right here, okay, if you can see that, there's a notch right there where my screwdriver is. This has to be exactly relative to the flat part of the cylinder head. And so the easiest way how I do this is I get myself a metal ruler from the stationary supply place, and I place it flat on the head. Wow, this leading edge at least is flat against the cylinder head. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my ratchet and I'm just going to turn it such that I know that the relative line on the sprocket here lines up with this leading edge of this ruler, which is indicative that it's flush with the cylinder head, and making sure that the little up letters are stamped, are pointing directly straight up on the engine. Now here's a service tip for you. So using the camshaft sprocket and ruler alignment method is a sure way of telling whether the upper portion of the engine is aligned properly. But another way that you can double check your work is to take a look at the crankshaft pulley and the relative 0-degree timing mark that's sort of sticking out of the lower timing belt cover. As you can see here, looking down at this little pointer, you can see that I've got my white timing mark from my crankshaft visible through that V channel right there, and that lone notch in our crankshaft pulley indicates that that's 0 degrees top dead center. And then to the left of that, you'll see that there's 3 marks with the middle one painted red, which indicates sort of the timing advance, which on this particular car we're not concerned about. Never, any under circumstances, align this V channel with any of those 3 marks located to the left of this image. So this is another way you can tell that your crank and camshafts align properly. Now, if this mark is off ever so slightly, as long as it's between that V, it's sufficient. If you are off too far ahead, say you move the crankshaft too far to the left, never, any under circumstances, rotate the engine clockwise to align it. Always do a full engine cycle by continuing to turn the crankshaft pulley counterclockwise. Okay, so now that we've got our engine aligned to top dead center and we've double, triple, quadruple checked our alignment, making sure that the engine orientation is where it needs to be, we can now use our nifty crankshaft holder tool, which I believe is a 50mm outside hex tool. This particular one I actually bought directly from Honda, and I believe it's made by Mac Tools. Really expensive, but you can buy a cheap copy version of it from your local AutoZone, I believe. We're going to go ahead and now place this tool into the cutout here of our crankshaft pulley. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind is that you may not be able to completely align this tool perfectly, and so it may require you to rotate the crankshaft a hair to the left or hair to the right. Now, I know that's sort of contradictory to what I said, but for the purposes of removing our crankshaft pulley bolt, we don't really have much of a choice if we don't have a hoist and someone to help us hold things. Fortunately, in my case, I'm only off by maybe a millimeter or 2, and so I can make this slight adjustment, and then I'll show you how to realign your crankshaft and camshafts because of this movement. How we're going to break this bolt loose is that we're going to now put our 19mm socket and a series of extensions and our breaker bar onto this bolt. I use a cheater bar on a series of extensions. This bar, by the way, is probably 6 feet long. I'm just going to break that crankshaft bolt loose. Now that took a lot of effort because this was never actually removed before in the past. And even though the Honda spec calls for 175 foot-pounds, I can assure you that that bolt was way tighter than that. I had to lean all my weight into that just to break it loose. And so now that it's loosened, we're going to actually use an impact gun, if you have access to one, or just hand tighten this again so that we have the ability to rotate the crankshaft and adjust our TDC position once again. So I'm just going to give it a tap with my impact gun to tighten it, and then repeat our TDC alignment process. So much like what I did in our step prior to this, I'm going to use my flat edge and rotate the engine several revolutions to get my engine crankshaft and camshaft position right. Now, some argue that they should loosen the crank bolt and then do this step to align, but I'd rather not, making sure that my engine's actually in time. It's essentially doing a double check, if that makes any sense. And I actually didn't even move the crankshaft all that much. So you can see, if you can see in my video, there's a notch here lined up with the flat edge, which is flush relative to that. And then if you can see under the poor lighting and tight engine space that my crankshaft pulley white mark is also still within the boundaries of that V, indicating that our engine is now in time again. We can now use our impact gun to remove that crankshaft bolt. And then very carefully wiggle the crankshaft pulley off of the crankshaft itself. Now, one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is that inside here there's a little wood rough key that might drop, so you might want to just put your finger against it. It's this tiny little metallic piece that just pops off, and it's a pain to find. So we pull off our crankshaft and then remove the little tiny wood rough key, and that's what it looks like, and set those aside. We can now go ahead and remove the lower timing belt cover, and I believe there's at least 4 or 5 screws here, and I'll try to point them out as best as I can. There's one here, one here, one here, one inside there, and now when you're removing the lower timing belt cover, once you remove the 4 screws, you also need to make sure that you use a screwdriver or your fingers to remove this cable out of this little cable channel for the crankshaft position sensor. Otherwise you're not going to be able to get this cover off properly. Okay, so it turns out that the lower timing belt cover only had 4 bolts holding it in. So 1, 2, 3, and then the 4th one is recessed in here. And then once I undid everything, it was kind of a pain to pull off because this sort of weatherproofing gasket was stuck onto the side of the engine block. So just make sure that when you're pulling it off that you try your best not to damage this gasket, and to ensure that you reinstall it back onto the lower timing belt cover. And of course, to align it, there's all these little nubs here that correspond to the notches cut out in the timing cover. What I find is that the gasket keeps falling out like this. I just use a little bit of RTV sealant or Honda Bond and just kind of glue some of the edges back onto this cover, because that's actually supposed to be an entire assembly. The other thing I want to mention here about the upper timing cover is that there's actually this groove right here, and this is where the crankshaft position sensor that plugs in way down here at the bottom sort of rotates up and is sort of pinned to the side of the engine block. So when you're removing this, you're going to also have to just use your fingers and just kind of pry that wiring harness out that would reside inside of here. So the next step here is to remove the driver's side engine mount so that we can route the timing belt off of the side of the engine. But in doing so, before doing so I should say, we need to make sure that we support the engine using our jack and a block of wood, and just make enough contact with the oil pan, which is the side where the driver's side is, where the weight's going to be. So you don't have to jack the engine up necessarily, just enough such that your jack makes sufficient contact. Using a 17mm socket, remove the side engine mount bolts, or nuts, sorry, located here, here, and here. So here's an example where you're removing a side engine mount bolt and then suddenly the stud comes out of the actual engine mount assembly. Now this could be due to the fact that there's corrosion on the threads, or sometimes I've just found that these things seize right up and then the entire assembly just comes out. So what actually happened on my particular bolt here is that you can see that the stud here is actually stripped, and this is why this never came off. And so now I'm going to have to go to Honda to order a replacement stud. No big deal here. I've actually run into this problem in the past on several vehicles, so this is nothing new to me. But basically once we've done that, we can go ahead and remove our mount like this. And just as a note, during my reassembly video, I'm not going to show me reinstalling this, but I'll tell you how to do it now. Is you're going to basically take 2 17mm nuts on the new stud, and then you're going to, well, imagine this is the one I put on, and then we're going to put another nut on top, and then put some Loctite on here, and making sure that we screw this stud all the way down into this side engine mount, like the one adjacent to it. If you don't screw the stud in all the way, say if it's only screwed in 3/4 of the way through, then over time vibration will actually tear out the aluminum threads that is holding the stud. I've seen that happen before, and people make that mistake by not reinstalling the stud properly. So unfortunately this front stud is damaged, but the new one to reinstall will literally look the same. So now that we've removed the engine mount dog bone here on the side and inadvertently screwed up one of the studs, which I'll have to order a new one from Honda, we have to now remove this aluminum engine mount from the engine block, and that consists of removing 3 bolts in the front here by the alternator area, and then 2 that's directly located underneath this mount. It's actually inside the mount. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts that need to be undone. Now, one of the things that make this portion of the job such a pain is that the 2 14mm bolts that bolt in the side of the engine this way are really hard to gain access to, and so sometimes, or in the past at least, I've used a ratchet to just loosen them and then used a little knurled plated tool that has a socket end on it to undo it from underneath. Now the alternative method here is to actually undo the side engine mount by removing the 3 14mm bolts. Now, when you remove the side mount, it actually gives you considerably more room to work with, and you can actually undo those side mount bolts usually from the top without killing yourself. So here's a neat little service tip here. For this back bolt, you can actually use a wrench to take it out, because you don't want to start taking off the ABS pump to gain access to this rear bolt. And I find that using ratchet wrenches makes a world of difference. And then just lift the mount out like this. Now to remove the side mount, you can use your hands and you can feel that there's actually 2 bolts here. And since we've got that much more room by removing the side mount, you can sort of get a sense of how I'm getting my tool in here to undo that bolt. Now be careful as you undo the bolt further and further out that you don't want to end up jamming your ratchet against the cross member of the frame of the car. Otherwise you're going to have some serious difficulties reversing that ratchet and getting it out. So using that little tool I mentioned earlier, I can now reach inside and then undo it by hand. Now depending, what I found sometimes is that you can actually remove that lower bolt easier by using a little ratcheting wrench like this from the bottom to take it off. You now go ahead and undo the front bolt by sliding that alternator bolt out of the way, and then reaching in underneath behind here to access this bolt by the exhaust manifold. When undoing the bolts, pay attention to the orientation of how the bolts are coming out, making sure that you made these bolts all back up in the same positions that they were removed from. Go ahead and remove the 2 bolts behind the alternator. And then carefully remove this engine mount assembly from the engine bay, taking care not to drop any of the bolts out from the mount. So as you can see, so this is what that side engine mount looks like. And so I had mentioned earlier in my video that the side mount bolts were actually a slightly different length, and I actually stand corrected. They're actually identical in length. It's actually the front bolts right here, the 3, that have differing lengths. And as you can see here, this lower one is actually shorter than the one on the top by a few millimeters. And conversely, the side one is also long like the top bolt. And the reason why is that if you actually take a look at the casting, if you've actually lost your orientation of which bolt goes where in terms of length, place them all inside the holes and then drop them in as such so that you can see what that relative length is, and they should all be even. And the shorter one should be on the bottom because it makes sense since the metal here is thinner, or it sits lower than these 2 other bolts. So just a quick service tip that when in doubt, place all the bolts in the appropriate positions, or use common sense by looking at how thick the overall metal is on the mounts. And this is what that timing belt area looks like. So as you can see, pay attention to the routing of how the belt is going to be installed. Basically, it runs down the front, down to the camshaft, or the crankshaft, up through this tensioner pulley, in, behind, and over the water pump, and then back up to the camshaft. So it's a fairly straightforward routing. So to detension the timing belt off of the engine, we're going to use a metric, and it has to be a metric 6mm hex or Allen key and socket that we're going to place into the little hex key on our tensioner, which is below. And it's going to go into a little hole on an arm. And then what we're going to do is that we're just going to gently turn it counterclockwise enough to pop the belt off. So if you can see here, the water pump is right up there, and this is the tensioner. And I just plugged that end onto our tensioner, and I'm just going to gently push. As you can feel, there's some spring action there. And as I spring that off, I can basically slide the belt off of the pulleys. So you can see here, I'm going to gently push enough and just slide our belt off of my camshaft pulley. And then just very slowly release. Now, to pull off the belt from the crankshaft, all we have to do is just carefully pull out the crankshaft timing sprocket and then remove our belt. So since we removed our lower timing belt crankshaft sprocket from the engine, we actually want to go ahead and also remove this little spacer ring, and that actually helps the timing belt realign properly in its travel path. And so the significance of this ring is actually meant for, as the belt is being sandwiched in, to make sure that there's a channel for this belt to run in like this. And then there's actually one end that's got a taper, this rounded taper here, if you can sort of see that. And so the rounded part is right here, and then the straight edge is on the back. This tapered portion right here actually needs to face the inside of this crankshaft sprocket, and the reason why is that as the belt is running, this rounded or chamfered part is actually guiding the belt squarely onto this little cog. And so we want to make sure that prior to reinstalling this, that there's no oil or residue on it. So we're going to clean this all up with a towel or a rag. Clean this part up, and take very careful care not to drop this part, because as these little nubs here on this ring signify, they're actually little magnetic pickup points for the crankshaft position sensor, which is actually located right here. And that's actually really critical for the engine to run and be timed properly through the ECU. Also, when we've removed that spacer ring, we want to just take a look at our engine seal right here to make sure that there's no oil. And on this car, because of the low miles, there's no traces of it. If it is leaking, then you're going to also have to replace that front main seal on the engine. So I'm just going to take a rag, clean things up. Just wipe things down and make sure they're nice and clean. And then I'm going to also clean my spacer ring here. And then making sure that I reinstall this onto the engine with this rounded chamfered part facing out. Because remember, this goes like this, and if I turn this sideways, that guide has to run that belt in between this. Always make sure that you triple check the orientation of this ring. So here's a quick thing I wanted to show you guys. So I mentioned earlier with the timing belt, the old timing belt still installed, that it was kind of difficult to see how, if we knew the crankshaft on the bottom end was at TDC, and it's not quite as easy as seeing it on the camshaft side since the timing cover has been removed. So you see here on the oil pump body, we see this little arrow pointing here. And then I mentioned earlier that on that timing belt cog, there was actually a little notch. If you actually place this back onto the crankshaft, you'll see that this line here, relatively speaking, actually will approximately line up with the pointer on the cog here. So I can't hold this very well, but I can tell you right now that these lines do line up this pointer is within several degrees of this mark on the crankshaft cog. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to place my timing belt onto my cog and then reinstall the cog. Okay, so now that we've loosely installed our timing belt onto the crankshaft cog, making sure that it's pressed up against the block, what we're going to do is we're going to carefully route our timing belt over the tensioner pulley, making sure that all the cogs or the grooves in the water pump are all lined up. And then so the last step is to make sure that all the teeth are in the notches, and then what we're going to do is we're going to detension our belt and pull up on the back of our timing belt gently such that we have the ability to stretch or to loop, this timing belt onto our camshaft. And if everything goes well, you should actually be able to easily slide the new timing belt back on to the camshaft sprocket as so. And so once that's done, and remember, do not reef on this ratchet, you just want to use like finger pressure to push it. So we do rehash here: your crankshaft cog up over your idler onto your water pump, and then when you're ready to slide it onto the camshaft pulley is when you detension the system and then pull gently up on the backside of the timing belt, and then that should, by default, the teeth should automatically line up with the camshaft sprocket teeth, and then everything should just slide in like it did as shown. And then so you just want to double check to make sure that that cog on the bottom is pressed up against the block, that you can see the spacer with the proper taper in the right direction. You want to make sure that the belt is going over this tensioner pulley properly. You want to make sure that all the teeth line up in your water pump and lined up squarely up against this ridge here, and then with minimal effort you should be able to get this on. What I'm going to do here is install that Woodruff key and then carefully reinstall my crankshaft pulley, and then using an impact gun just very lightly reinstall the crankshaft bolt. The reason why you need to use an impact gun is when you turn the engine counterclockwise, that's the same way as unscrewing a screw. So I've installed my Woodruff key and my crankshaft pulley back on. I'm just going to give the engine several rotations very slowly, counterclockwise, to make sure that my timing belt, for one, self-tensions back to what the auto tensioner is supposed to tighten the timing belt to, and to make sure that I feel to see if my pistons are interfering with the intake and exhaust valves. And you would know because it takes no effort to rotate the engine, and if you mistimed the engine, you'll feel some resistance during your turning, and the moment you feel any, you need to immediately stop. So how I do this is I rotate the crankshaft at least probably 15 rotations, and in fact I rotated enough times to make the oil pump start pumping oil to the head. And so once I've done that, I take my flat edge ruler again, look for the up on the crankshaft pulley, and then just measure to see if I'm at TDC. So I'm at the little mark, as we saw several times in the video already, and I didn't feel any resistance. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bang off my crankshaft pulley and just see to make sure that that crankshaft cog is in the relative correct position. So you can see here, camshaft's at TDC. That little notch, if you can see that, on that cog is in fact lined up to the little arrow on our engine block. There you go. See that arrow behind the belt? Lines up perfectly with my mark on my cog. And we can again verify that once we install the lower covers and everything else. So another thing that I like to check before I put on the engine mounts and the covers is to make sure that I push on the front of my timing belt. And as you can see here in the video, it doesn't really deflect much, but then with just a little bit of light finger force it doesn't really move. And just to make sure that there's no weird things like the belt, you know, coming off of the pulleys or looking like they're tracking all crooked, you should always see just a tiny edge of this camshaft sprocket, and the edge of the idler pulley should be flush with the side of the belt. And of course the cog on the bottom there will fit perfectly between the spacer and the magnetic tipped end of our crankshaft cog. So now let's go ahead and reinstall the side engine mount. Now, prior to doing any reinstallation work of our fasteners, especially when it comes to components that mount into aluminum or any type of metal for that matter, I always like to just coat everything with a liberal amount of anti-seize. And the reason why is that it prevents galling and seizing of fasteners, and that's more so important when you're using dissimilar metals such as steel and aluminum. So as you can see from my engine mount stud damaged earlier, that's a direct result of galling and corrosion creating the need for me to replace more parts on this car. So what we're going to do here is that on the side mount, I remember which bolts I took off from the front, but I have to remember to keep the side bolts sort of pre-installed and then slowly and carefully realign them and reinstall them on the engine. Now remember, anytime you're reinstalling screws onto your vehicle, at no point, especially when you've coated things with lots of anti-seize, should you ever run into a scenario where they're difficult to screw in. If you even feel the slightest amount of resistance, stop and reevaluate whether or not you're stripping or damaging the fasteners. Now the reason why you want to loosely install the mounts is that generally when you're trying to align 5 screws into 5 different holes, you're not going to get it the first time. And so when things are nice and loose, it makes alignment a little easier. So before I install my lower timing belt cover, I had that problem where this rubber gasket was kind of coming off. So what I did was I got some of this product here called Permatex Ultra Gray and basically just applied a little blob of it inside the little channel there just to hold this gasket in place so that it doesn't fall out. The last thing you actually want to do is inadvertently have this gasket get jammed up inside the timing belt area, which would cause it to hop a tooth or two and then cause irreparable damage to your motor. So it's actually really important that we glue this piece back into place. Once we've reinstalled the cover, make sure that you take the crankshaft sensor cable here and push that back into this little channel here on the timing belt cover to secure the cable. We can go ahead and reinstall the woodruff key into the notch on the crankshaft, and it should sit flush with the face of the crankshaft. It might just stick out like a hair, but generally speaking it's quite flush. reinstall the crankshaft, paying careful attention to the woodruff key, that it stays in place on the notch on the crankshaft pulley. Now the purpose of the woodruff key here is to make sure that the crankshaft remains aligned relative to the crankshaft itself. And the reason why that's important is that, remember we saw in the crankshaft earlier that there's some timing marks on the side of this crankshaft to tell us where TDC is. Well, if that woodruff key goes out of sync, then how do you know what TDC is when you're doing a spot check on your engine? So that woodruff key is super important. The next step here is to lubricate or install the crankshaft bolt, but prior to doing so we need to lubricate the threads thoroughly with some engine, or in my case I'm just going to use some 3-in-1 oil from a squirt can. It works the same. And then also place some oil underneath the bolt where it contacts the washer, but not getting any oil here on the surfaces that contact the crankshaft pulley. So to do this, squirt some on and then squirt some in underneath the head of the bolt, and then just give that a spin, and then I'm just going to screw that in. So at this stage, before we actually continue tightening things down, we're going to go ahead and check to make sure that TDC is aligned on the crankshaft and on the camshaft. So using my flat edged ruler, I can see that my camshaft hasn't moved, where the up marker is right here, and then that side notch in the pulley is still flush with the head. Okay, so we said the camshaft was TDC, and as you can see here, the timing mark on the timing cover after we reinstalled it is also at TDC. Tighten the crankshaft bolt until I hear a click. So we want to make your torque wrench click at least 5 times to ensure that things are tightened down properly. You can now go ahead and reinstall our engine mount on the side here. We want to make sure that before we sort of glue the valve cover back onto the cylinder head, that we take a screwdriver and very carefully remove the liquid gasket, the Honda bond that came from the factory. In order for a good bond to occur or to happen, you need to make sure that the surfaces are clean. Now, you don't want to just start scraping away. You need to be really careful not to gouge the cylinder head surfaces. So I just sort of use a pair of needle nose pliers and a screwdriver, and I just kind of pick away and pull off what I can until the surfaces are clean. And the only places that you should actually only see the liquid gasket being used is on these curved areas on the cylinder head, where you see me sort of picking away and scraping away. Next, we can go ahead and reinstall our spark plugs, paying careful attention to ensure that the crush washer here is flush against the body of the spark plug, and making sure that you've coated all the threads thoroughly with anti-seize compound. Now, as a service tip here, you want to make sure that when you're reinstalling your spark plugs that you never use a ratchet or a tool, a power tool to reinstall them. You want to hand thread everything in so that you don't run into a cross thread situation, which would require major head repairs. And you also want to make sure that you don't over torque them. Now, the reason why I'm reinstalling these right away is that when I'm reinstalling my valve cover and anything on top of the motor, I don't want something to inadvertently fall into the engine. So next, we're going to go ahead and prepare our valve cover so that it can be reinstalled onto our engine. And we're going to do this by just giving all the surfaces a good wipe to remove all the oil, and to remove any gasket, liquid gasket that was used from the factory on these little corner points right here, 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 and here. What we're going to need here is we're going to use this Permatex Gray product, and then we're just going to get our fingertips and apply a small amount of this liquid gasket onto those curved corners of our valve cover gasket, like this. And you don't need a lot, you just need a little bit, just kind of dab it up and down. Do the same for the other side. The reason why we need liquid gasket is that because there's a 90-degree transition corner where oil could potentially leak. And so as a precautionary measure, Honda recommends that you use some Honda Bond or equivalent sealer, which is really actually Permatex Ultra Gray, on those surfaces. So after 5 minutes has elapsed and the liquid gasket has had some time to set, what you want to do is you actually want to pull these studs out as far as they'll go in the valve cover, such that they're all flush on the inside with the surfaces. Don't pull too hard because you can actually rip the grommets right out. You just want it pulled out such that on the inside here you can see they're just at the flush of the inside of the valve cover. And so to reinstall it, what we need to do is just carefully tuck the right hand side in first. Just double check, make sure nothing's in your way. Is to tuck it over such that you clear the air conditioning hoses. And then as you're doing that, just slide everything into place and it should just kind of fall onto the valves or the cylinder head, and then get it to seat like so. And so when it's pressed down, you'll see here on the sides that it's nice and flush at the timing cover, or it actually covers the lip, and that the spark plug tubes here, they all protrude and they're nice and smooth and everything looks like it's fitting good. Now, one thing I like to do when I do a reinstall is that once everything's down, make sure there's no gaskets hanging and dangling out the side of the cover. I just give the cover a good wiggle like this, and then I begin tightening down the valve cover bolts. Now you're tightening down your valve cover bolts, you just want to carefully, using a ratchet or your hand, just feel and sort of pre-thread the studs back into the head. And again, as you can see, there's no effort involved in screwing these things in. Very much like how you install spark plugs and all your other screws on your vehicle, you don't want to cross-thread something like this, otherwise you're never going to be able to get this fixed properly. So everything went in really smooth. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to tighten the valve cover bolts in a staggered pattern, starting with, I'm just going to tighten the top left, and let's tighten the lower center, top right, furthest left, furthest right. And again, as far as torque is concerned, it's about 9 foot-pounds, just hand tight really. Now remove the alternator tensioner piece, which is this little bracket on a bolt. And so more often than not, corrosion and dirt make it extremely difficult to take out. So what I do is I spray the threads down with WD-40, and then I use a pair of pliers to hold the ear against the bracket, and then use my wrench or my hands to sort of undo this bolt. And this is what that piece looks like once it's been removed. You can see there's a lot of corrosion and just dirt. But how this works is that that lower alternator mounting bolt that would push up in here would pass through, and then as you tighten this bolt, it would be against a flange, and that would essentially pull the alternator away from the engine block, which would tighten the belt. So what we're going to do actually is, once we've removed it, we're just going to coat this with a liberal amount of anti-seize, and then we're going to reinstall it in this orientation through that lower bracket. So we're going to reinstall the alternator, and I'd mentioned earlier in my video that we're going to take this assembly piece, which is the alternator and air conditioning belt tensioner bolt, and we're going to pass it through this lower bracket and then just loosely install it such that this bolt and this ringlet, or this ring eye I guess, is fully extended. And the reason why we want to do that is so that it gives us the most working room for the alternator, because as you tighten this bolt, it actually shortens, or it pulls the alternator away from the engine, which makes the belt tighter. So what we're going to do is take our alternator and put it back into our engine bay, like so. and then just loosely tighten the upper 14mm bolt. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to reinstall this lower alternator bolt, and that's why that that tensioner piece, that tightener, has to be extended fully so that we can kind of wiggle the alternator back and forth so we can feel how this bolt will pass through that little ringlet and then screw back into the alternator body. Since the alternator is made out of aluminum, use lots of anti-seize compound again. Now if you're struggling to get that lower alternator bolt in from the top, you can always still go through the open wheel well where the timing belt and the crankshaft pulley was. And see, and that's basically what it looks like installed. Now sometimes you have an alignment issue with the slider bracket, which is this piece right here. And so right above my light you see there's that bolt. That's a 14mm bolt that you can loosen up that will also help that slider rail shift up and down just a little bit. This is especially true if you're using alternators that are rebuilt, or if things have shifted around, that it sometimes helps to loosen this bolt right there, which will help give you more vertical adjustment onto your alternator lower mounting bolt. We now go ahead and reinstall the alternator and AC compressor belt, and we just simply route that over the outer edges of the crankshaft pulley, compressor, and alternator. Again, having the open wheel well on the bottom really helps making this installation process a lot easier. To tighten our belts, we're going to go ahead and tighten our little thumb knob that we had removed earlier. Once the belt has been sufficiently tightened where there's not very much movement on the belt, tighten the upper and lower alternator mounting bolts. Reattach the air conditioning suction line bracing bracket. Flip the engine harness over and then reinstall them. Plug in your EGR valve, plug in your coolant temperature sensor, reinstall your spark plug ignition coils, tighten them down, reinstall your alternator power connector, and then plug the alternator sensing cable back in and tighten that nut on the back. Now when you're tightening this nut, it just needs to be snug. It doesn't have to be torqued down or anything like that, just because there's no value in doing so. Plug in the camshaft position sensing cable, located here. Make sure it has a solid click, and then reinstall the weatherproof boot into the valve, into the timing cover. Reinstall the alternator bracket clips. We need to reinstall this stud such that it seats flush against this smooth portion of the stud bolt, So how we're going to actually do this is I'm going to take my brand new nut here, and I'm actually going to install the nut backwards, and then I'm going to take a corresponding nut that wasn't damaged during the removal process, and I'm going to screw that here on top so that they sort of butt up against each other like this, so I can use a ratchet and basically turn this down and screw it onto the engine mount. And so before we do the reinstallation, I want to use a little bit of Permatex blue removable thread locker, just to make sure that this stud doesn't ever come out of this mount again. I don't need a lot of thread locker, just because, well, you just don't. Just enough to coat the threads like this. And then we're going to hand thread it in to get the threads all started out. And then using our 17mm ratchet, we're going to go ahead and just install the stud into the engine mount. So it shouldn't be difficult to do. It should actually be really easy to screw in. And you just got to basically stop when the stud stops turning into the mount. You don't need to crank down on it. Just make it such that that smooth part is flush with the engine mount. So to remove the stud, or the nuts now holding the stud in place, we're just going to use our wrench to hold the lower nut and then undo the top nut with a ratchet. And then once that's broken free, you can just undo it by hand. Then remove the next nut after that. And that's how you reinstall a engine mount stud, or any stud on an engine for that matter, properly. So you can see in the video that smooth part is flush against that engine mount. So we now go ahead and reinstall the engine dog bone by dropping this in. Now if you find that you can't get the dog bone in properly, sometimes it helps to actually lower the engine a little bit within the engine bay. And that'll give you a little bit of clearance from this ABS modulator. And once you've got that dog bone loosely installed, carefully raise the engine up again. And just give the dog bone a wiggle until it just naturally falls into place. And then what you're going to do is you're actually going to jack up this engine up until this aluminum engine mount contacts the dog bone, which tells you that it's at the proper height. Not that it matters, because once you tighten everything down, it'll tighten up, but it's get your geometry right the first time and you're better off. Now to tighten them, I just give it a quick bang with a impact wrench or gun. Our next step is to reinstall our power steering reservoir bracket, located here. And then bring your power steering pump over from where you left it on top of the motor, and then just fish the corresponding bolts. This is the lower bolt, through the bottom hole here on the bracket, and then through the lower portion of the pump. You install the little upper bracket piece here. I forgot to show you guys in the video that I also reinstalled this little air conditioning suction line securing bracket. I don't think that was in the video. The next thing is to install this funky looking bolt through the upper mounting hole. And then reinstall your power steering tensioner wing nut bolt. And from this stage, make sure that that's pressed all the way down. We can now go ahead and loop our power steering belt back down towards the crankshaft, and because your wheel well cover is still open, you just got to hook it around the crankshaft. Tighten the power steering pump belt by carefully lifting the power steering pump up to tension the belt, and to make it easier and faster to turn this tightening knob. And just continue tightening by hand only until you can't really turn it any further, and that's usually enough. Using your 12mm wrench, tighten the securing nut. Hand tight. Conversely, use your 12mm 1/4" drive socket to tighten the lower one below the belt line. Since the fasteners are really small, do not over tighten. Reinstall the power steering pump reservoir back in the bracket. Clip the power steering hoses back into the appropriate brackets. Reinstall your throttle cable and cruise control cables. And secure them with the cap nuts. Once the engine mount has been securely tightened, proceed to remove the hydraulic jack from underneath the oil pan. Flip our folded out of the way lower wheel well cover and reinstall our little securing clips by pressing the holes and then pressing down into the locking position. Reattach the negative cable to the battery. And reinstall our top engine garnish trim cover. Prior to starting the engine, it's also a good practice to make sure that you double check your vehicle and make sure that there's no extra bolts or tools or anything laying around within the engine bay where you were working. And if all is good and you've quadruple checked to make sure that your engine does in fact go to TDC, proceed to start the car. So as you can see from my video demonstration, replacing a timing belt on your 7th generation Honda Civic or 2nd generation Acura 1.7 EL single overhead cam, VTEC and non-VTEC engines is a fairly straightforward process. In total, I've spent maybe about 3 hours of time, and parts costed me less than $60 for a genuine Honda timing belt and even a replacement engine mount stud and nut. I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.